Hey there, want to know readers. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm with Tony Brasunas, a committed media activist researching and writing about censorship and media literacy and disinformation for a number of years now. And you've actually recently written a book I have right here, Red, White, and Blind: The Truth About Disinformation and the Path to Media Consciousness. Thanks for being with me today, Tony, to share your wisdom with our readers.
Delighted to be here, Amber. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, what important work to be doing right now. We live in such a complex world, and mainstream media rarely tells us the whole story. And, there are lots of key issues right now that you actually address in your book that need to be brought into public awareness, that aren't always aligned with social consensus. Yet, we're all doing our best to make sense of this vast information landscape. And with people like you writing about these issues, bringing it into public dialogue, offering the world a more constructive vision for our media systems right now, that go beyond partisan politics and official narratives. What noble work to be a part of.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I do, and I agree with that. We live in a time where we have an unparalleled ability to know the truth about the world through the internet and through all of this amazing technology that's available, and the ability for us to connect with each other and directly share our experiences. And yet, we're also living through the time of what I call the age of propaganda, where the lies and the disinformation is at an unparalleled level as well. And so that's why I wrote Red, White, and Blind. I wanted people to first understand the problem. So I spend about 2/3 of the book laying out the problem, but
Mm.
then also understand that we're really at an unparalleled time. We have an opportunity to see through it. Really try to lay out in the book the ways that we can hone our own, bullshit detectors, but also hone our own broadness of conception. So I talk a lot about a balanced media diet, and then I talk about this idea of media consciousness, which I think is really the ultimate goal for all of us. And it's not this like refined spiritual state, although we all can quest that as well. It's a state of awareness where when we hear a narrative, we hear a story, oh, something happened, they blew up a pipeline in the Baltic Sea, or yeah, like there's another booster that's recommended. When we hear something coming out and what's being said about it, we don't just listen to the story. And also usually there's a way we're supposed to feel. So you also understand that. Who are we supposed to trust? Who are we supposed to fear? Who gets to speak about this, who doesn't, and what do they want me to feel? What do they want me to fear? What do they want me to hope for? And just a couple of those questions, that's really media consciousness, is that as you come into contact with the next story, think about those things first. It doesn't mean you have to change your views. You can keep all of your views, without getting into like controversial issues, but to just have that ability, that consciousness. And I think to get there, at least in my experience, it's not like I'm not in the state of red, white, and blind anymore. I'm still in that state as well. We're all in the state of deception. But I'm on this journey towards media consciousness where I'm working every day to broaden my media diet and think a little bit more broadly about things. So that's the goal.
That's powerful. Yeah, just something I'm realizing in my own rabbit hole, uh, you know, like hardcore proud to be liberal turned independent, especially in the wake of 2020, and I started questioning everything. It's like, wow, the more I know, the less I know. And that used to scare me, but now I see it as this a place of empowerment to be constantly questioning what I see and not just buying into anything I'm being told. Any narrative that incites violence or division or scapegoating, I'm automatically, question marks over my head, like, what's happening here? Like, and I think this really goes along with media consciousness of like, uh involving our whole body in the process, because when you see a polarizing narrative or a headline, it's like there's a body response. Like, it's not just a head response. It's like sometimes it's like I read something that doesn't confirm my own biases and I tense up and I get stressed. And I think for all of us to start thinking well means to be able to regulate our emotions more and be aware that a lot of these narratives, not just corporate, also independent, serve to make us feel a certain way, right? And sometimes in that process, it shuts off an open mind and open heart in an open dialogue about these complex issues.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I totally agree with you. And I mentioned, in the book, I try to get into some of the ways that we can distinguish and decipher
Hmm.
false narratives. And yeah, that is one of them. And in the balanced media diet, I basically use kind of a diet pyramid. Maybe I can find it in the book where, let's see if I can find it. Because I distinguish, and in the balanced media diet, I actually propose this full diet of 40 different sources. I looked at a lot of news sources,
Hmm.
but I basically let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, here. So I don't know if you can see it for your viewers here, but so to the top, and you can see it, right? So there's foreign news, and then there's what I call party politics. And so that's divided into red news and blue news, right? And those are the sources that like your sort of everyday corporate media. It's like NPR with this like Democrat bias, or it's Fox News with the Republican bias. And they're doing what you're saying, right? Which is dividing. And pretty much whenever you listen to NPR, the sort of subtle or not so subtle message is that it's all the fault of the Republicans, whatever the problem is. And then on Fox News, it's sort of the reverse, right? There's, it just so happens, just by coincidence, whatever we're talking about at the end of the report, we're going to tell you that the problem is the Democrats. And so, just thinking about that, like, is that really true that every problem could be the fault of this other political party? But then, there's what I call true politics and then deep politics. And these are sort of true politics is actually, and these are sources in the diet. True politics is criticize politics and independent or corporate media. There's less corporate media that will actually criticize both parties. So that's always a good sign. If you read if you read an article and there's criticism for both parties, it usually means they're thinking outside of that dichotomy. And usually that's a good sign that there's going to be some legitimate, what I call true politics. So a true progressive in the sense that like you want to spread wealth and power more broadly, or a true libertarian where like you believe that setting everybody free is the best path to happiness. Some of these like real core beliefs, or conservatism where you want to defend sort of like the defining traditions and principles of our society. These are like really legitimate political philosophies, and to find media that is coming from that place rather than, well, we can't have the bad guy in there and it's Biden or Trump, well, whatever it is, blue no matter who, or like rather than that thinking, which it's not completely worthless. There's some of that in there. We want to know what's going on in the narratives. We want to be able to understand people in our lives, what they're exposed to. We also want to hone our own bullshit detector. We want to hone our own skills. And so you don't want to just completely cut out CNN, NPR, Fox News, New York Times from your diet, because then those are opportunities to do what you're saying, which is to actually learn that, to hone media consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then without getting into all of the nitty gritty of the diet, which I could spend a whole hour just getting into that. And I'm building a website, balancedmediadiet.com, where you can really delve into it all. And also redwhiteandblind.com you can go to. I guess I should mention my URLs, good marketing. But balancedmediadiet.com is this one with the diet. And so deep politics is, maybe where want to know would be. Deep politics is like going to go even beyond the true politics and analyze the sort of systemic issues in the country. Is there a permanent state or a deep state? And if so, what is it doing? Like news about that, what's going on at that level? The willingness to look at, are the parties, actually in cahoots on some level, right? Are they actually, why does these important things like Medicare for all always seem to fail by one vote? Like, is it just a coincidence, or like, it always seems to like, even in California where we have a super majority of the, and, these things seem to still just kind of barely fail. So that's the diet. And I really think that if you can develop your own ability to see these narratives, that really is, I think, that is the path. And I spent the last 3-4 years writing about this because I think this is the pressing issue. I think it is the meta issue that, yes, it's important to think about something like climate change and that narrative. Is that a narrative? Is that a huge problem? Or something like, the vaccines, or something like the Ukraine war, or something like Medicare for all, or even getting into like gun rights and abortion, all the controversial issues, or election fraud, which I almost wrote my book about. That's also so important. But I came back to this because I think this is the defining issue that prevents or enables us to actually tackle anything else with real potential for solutions. If we can actually have debates, if we can actually maintain our democracy, maintain free speech, understand what propaganda and disinformation is and what they're used for. It's once we have those things that we can actually tackle these other issues. And until we can, even if the solution comes along, like let's say RFK Jr. is the perfect candidate for president, but the fact that he's running in a country where the media is so arrayed against it, it's going to be almost impossible, you know? And let's say you don't think RFK Jr. is the best and you think it's Trump. It's similar, right? There's this like complete media narrative about Trump that, you know, there's only a tangential relationship to reality, I think. So that's why I wrote this. And I packed as much into this book as I could, tackling all of the controversial issues of the day. I really wanted to use each of the stories that I think we know about or have thought about as, like, to the extent I can, as sort of teachable moments. Okay, so here's this thing when, you know, remember the protester in Washington that had the MAGA hat, and everybody's like, oh, and he was like supposedly harassing this Native American, and it was this whole narrative for like 2 days, and then the video surfaced, and it was actually the Native American was harassing the white kids, and he was like getting all up in their face. We finally had real video of it, and you just saw the way that the narrative was just so down the road. It was already sure that these like white kids wearing MAGA hats were just evil white supremacists, and then you watch the real video. It's like, no, they're actually really trying to diffuse the situation, and they're like singing the song to try to like calm everybody down. Anyways, just things like that. So I use stories like that. Like, let's just look at what happened and how the media got the narrative gets composed, and how they remove countervailing voices. And then I even get into a little bit of the complexity of the modern day, which is like what I call astroturf independent media, where you have independent, like Bellingcat, right? You have these websites that look like independent media, but then you realize they're controlled by the same sources that control the corporate media. And fact checking also does this as well. So fact checking, this is really appealing idea, like, oh, we'll just have sites that go in and fact check for me. So then I don't have to develop media consciousness, because I'll just have this fact checker.
Right.
Then you realize, you delve into the fact checkers, they're controlled by the same, they're getting all their money from Google and Facebook. So they're being controlled by the same groups.
So what drew you to this work of studying the media, you know, and what you call media consciousness? Like what led you to this point?
So I started really my media awareness journey way back in like 2002, 2003. I had been in China for a while. My first book is called Double Happiness. It's about my experiences in China. And I had noticed the heavy propaganda there. And then I came back to the United States and I started writing, and I just started to follow politics. I talk about this in the book quite a bit, this awakening when I was following Ralph Nader at the time. And then I started my own political web magazine, online magazine called Garlic and Grass. And the first issue we did was about the media and about how the consolidation of the media that had been going on was reducing the amount of voices available to Americans. And it's funny because that's 2002 or 3. I have to go back. I think I wrote that in 2002, that first issue. And now we're 20 years later, and the situation is way worse, at least for the corporate media. But it was the issue that we did, the third issue we did. And at the time I was very, wouldn't say naive. I was just early in my journey, I guess. And so we did an issue about 9/11, and it was called Did Bush Know? And I came into the issue very agnostic. In fact, I thought that, you know, most likely the official story was the real story. And our first 2 issues, so one was about the media, the other was about voting and sort of election reform. And they had, like, you know, some following, and then, you know, I got some traction and some email subscribers and stuff, and it was great. But that third issue just went viral, you know, like maybe the way that things don't do anymore because everybody's shadow banned, but it just like was an amazing upswing. I couldn't believe the amount of attention and people on both sides, and a lot of people sharing information with me that I had never seen. Like, that's the beginning of my awakening, and seeing how much appetite there was for discussion outside the main narrative about things. And so to tell my story, I'll skip forward a bit. So then I wrote, I became a sort of journalist on the side, moonlighting as a journalist. My main career was a software engineer, but I started writing as a passion. I ended up writing for the San Francisco Chronicle a bit. But then I'm going to jump forward to the story to where really Red, White, and Blind got started. So it's 2015. And the Bernie Sanders, I'm on the left, I'm a progressive. I was with Matt Gonzalez at the Green Party in San Francisco trying to win the mayor's race. I got really involved in that. And then the Bernie Sanders thing starts. And this is when the sort of next step of my awakening really takes over. And so I'm writing about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton from the Bernie Sanders perspective, and there's not nearly as many people writing from that perspective. And I published this piece on my Medium blog about privilege, and people had said, oh, you know, you're just a bunch of privileged people if you can vote for Bernie. Like, you know, don't you realize we all have to support Hillary because she could, a woman, and could be president. And so I just wrote this piece saying, like, look, it's not, I'm not going to try to hit every argument, but I think the privileged position is that if you don't need, like I called it, check your privilege if you can, if you're okay with Hillary Clinton and 8 years of the status quo. And Hillary Clinton was basically saying, we're going to do the status quo. So there's not going to be a $15 minimum wage. That was Bernie. If you don't need student debt cancellation, if you don't need Medicare for all, if you don't need any of those things and you can support the status quo, I think that's the privileged position. The people that actually need these things, that absolutely need a $15 minimum wage, that need Medicare for all, that need all of this, those are the people that I think we shouldn't be calling privileged. So I wrote that piece and I put it up, and you know, it got a lot of following. And then Haley Miller from Huffington Post approached me directly, like direct message on Twitter, and said, hey, we'd like to publish this at Huffington Post, and we'd like you to come write for us. And so I did. So I ended up covering the whole primary season for Huffington Post, and things went really well. I was writing about all different kinds of things from the Bernie Sanders perspective. And often my pieces would be shared by, you know, get 50,000, 100,000 views, and sometimes occasionally reach the front page of Huffington Post when they were, you know, read quite broadly. And then something happened right before the convention. I wrote this piece basically saying, here's the reasons why it's going to come down to the superdelegates. Neither Hillary nor Bernie have won enough pledged delegates to claim the nomination outright. We're going to go to a contested convention in Philadelphia. Here's why. And the superdelegates, these like people that vote with the strength of 10,000 mere mortals, the superdelegates are going to get to decide who is the nominee. And Donald Trump has just won the nomination on the Republican side. Bernie's polling much better head to head against Trump. And I wrote a number of reasons, laying out the reasons why I think the superdelegates should go with Bernie Sanders. This is a couple days before the convention. And I really focused on the issue of trust. And I said, when it comes to independent voters, who are going to largely be settling this election, it's going to come down to the independent voters. They're going to think a lot about trust. And I laid out some of the reasons that people don't trust Hillary Clinton. And then I laid out some reasons that people do trust Bernie Sanders with his, you know, at the time, I was a big fan of the consistency that he had on a lot of the political issues. I published the piece on, I think it was a Tuesday night, and I was going to fly to Philadelphia for the convention on Friday. And I woke up on Wednesday morning and the piece was gone. It had already had like 50,000 views or something, and it was just taken down. And I would never write again for Huffington Post. I tried to log in, my login credentials didn't work anymore. And it was really interesting because so I had written about censorship sort of from a distance up until that time, and I was aware that it could happen. But I think I was in this mentality of like, oh, I mean, coming out of 9/11 and the first Iraq War, it was really the people on the left, the liberals, that were really about free speech. And they really were very strong, you know, free speech. And it was more the right was more about, we need to censor voices that are unpopular. We need to get rid of voices that are saying things like, you know, whether it was about 9/11 or it was about Saddam Hussein. And so things were really about to flip, as I think we all know now, looking back at that time, but I was not aware, I was not ready for it in a sense. On the one hand, there is censorship, and there is a significant control of the narrative that is being exerted by places like Huffington Post and all of the corporate media. But on the other hand, we're at what I call the beginning of the new Enlightenment. And the reason that is because of the internet, and because it is disrupting and disintermediating their ability to prevent us from talking directly to each other, like the fact you and I can have this conversation. And how that little kernel is in this story is, so I go online that day, it's Wednesday morning, and I'm like, where's my article? I don't know where it is. And I go on and I'm sort of just searching on the internet, and I find on this like subreddit, like, hey, where'd Tony Brasunas's piece go? Like, I was trying to find his piece and where to go. Oh, here it is. Somebody copied it and pasted it on this little blog. I'm like, oh, look, there's my piece. So I copy it and paste it and put it on Medium, which I had basically neglected for 3 months or whatever. And I put it there, and I just put a link on Twitter. I didn't have a huge Twitter following at the time. I just put it on there. And then I got on the plane to go to Philadelphia, and I landed, and a number of people came up to me. And, you know, I don't know if people really recognize me, but I had a few people that knew who I was and were like, oh yeah, we read your article. We don't know why it was censored and taken down, but we totally agree with you. We think that your arguments all make sense. And, and these were, of course, people that were reading me were probably Bernie supporters. So it's maybe not, rocket science that they would agree with me. But the point is that I then realized within the next 2 days that piece became my most widely read article of the year.
Wow.
So Huffington Post, I mean, I had used the platform of Huffington Post for that entire season, and certainly it helped. But the fact that censorship and what I call or it's not my name, but the Barbara Streisand effect, right? Which is this idea that when you try to censor something, it actually triggers this human nature. We want to know things that are hidden. We want to know things that are secret. And if we find them of value, we want to share them. There's something very salutary about that in human nature. But so that's the new Enlightenment beginning, which is that they couldn't, as much as they tried to silence me and get rid of this piece, it actually flowered and was read more broadly than any of my other pieces that I had written.
Wow. That's powerful. And so you were actually at the convention there for the next few days, right?
Yeah, in Philadelphia. Yeah.
Yeah. How was that for you?
It was a wild experience. I hadn't been to a convention. I don't think I'd ever been to one of the conventions before. And again, it's like you can be aware of these things, but then to experience them firsthand is very different, right? I was aware of censorship and then experiencing it firsthand. I was aware that there was this idea that there's one convention if you're in person and there's another that's presented on TV and that they're different. We kind of all know that, like, oh, things are made for TV so that they look better. And, we all kind of have experienced that to some extent. But with these political conventions, it's a whole nother level. I mean, there's literally what's going on, which is sort of the nuts and bolts of democracy, or at least the feeling of the nuts and bolts of democracy going on, these like giant conventions and people and delegations and people meeting and talking and the whole thing. And then there's what's presented on television. And this one was particularly intense that way. And so one of my tweets that actually, I kind of broke a story at that convention is because I didn't have credentials to get inside. You had to either be a delegate or what's called an official volunteer, which is the candidate picks them. So Bernie Sanders and his group picked their people. But I was there. And so I was outside and I was doing my independent media thing. So I had a big Facebook following. So I basically do these videos and put them on Facebook at the time. But I had a tweet that was really popular because what happened is somebody came out to me on the second day and said, hey, they've just kicked out all of the volunteers, the Bernie volunteers. So there's two groups of people that are allowed into the convention. When you see the giant stadium, it's the delegates themselves who are actually people. I ran as a delegate for Bernie. I wasn't elected in Oakland, California, but there were people that were elected. So they actually go to the convention. They're the delegates that actually sit there and say, yes, we support Bernie Sanders for the nominee. And then there's what's called the official volunteers. And that's this other group. They're even slightly more than the delegates, but there's like 1,000 or a couple thousand of them. And so then you see this, when you see the stadium, it's like all of the Bernie official delegates and the official volunteers, and you have all of the Hillary delegates and volunteers. And if there's a third candidate, there'd be the third, and and they get their numbers in proportion to the delegates that they earned. So if you don't know that and you're just like, oh, the volunteers got banned, that's interesting, but I don't know why volunteers are even there. But you don't realize what that term means. And so what they had done is they had basically revoked all of the privileges, all of the badges to get into the convention for the Bernie volunteers. So that means they basically, by more than half, they reduced by more than half the number of people that supported Bernie from getting inside. And that story was nowhere. And so I tweeted it out because somebody came and told me, and that broke the story. Like there's people quoted my tweet and they're like, it looks like they're banning all of the volunteers for the Bernie Sanders side. But it was much worse than that. I had people telling me, and you could see all this stuff on Facebook. I wrote a number of articles and put them up. All this stuff was going on. They had installed all of these intense sort of high-tech white noise machines that are directed. So they could direct white noise right at a particular part of the amphitheater or the stadium. So if it's all the Bernie people are up there and they're saying, boo, Hillary, we don't want Hillary. Shh. They direct the white noise right there. Wow. Then you don't hear those people. And they're silent on the thing. So there's a number of things that went on. I tried to capture it all. It was never totally proven, but there were enough pieces to connect the dots that they actually had put up ads on Craigslist to hire people that would come and sit in the stadium and hold Hillary signs because they had kicked out all the Bernie people. And so there needed to be bodies sitting there. And so they brought in a bunch of people. I mean, my point in this book, and certainly not in this interview, is to sort of relitigate 2016. You know, people voted for Hillary, people voted for Bernie, and we could get all into that. But what kicked off Red, White, and Blind was really that experience of being censored and realizing the extent of the issue. And I wanted to learn more about it. And that's really what started it. I wanted to understand, where is the censorship coming from? How widespread is it? Who's doing it? And so it launched me down this path that really has been fascinating. So I wanted to write this book, and this is what I spent the last, kind of 6 months of it, is really writing a book that's a nonpartisan critique of the media and critique of disinformation and what those terms really mean. What really is disinformation, and what is propaganda, and what is censorship, and really delving into those terms. What is free speech? How important are those things? And looking at a lot of the different stories. So I can do a reading if you'd like. I think it might be interesting to sort of show you how the book, I like to use storytelling, and I also like to open the book with nonpartisan or as close to nonpartisan stories as I can, to present this story so it's accessible to everyone, to realize that this is the problem that we're dealing with today. So this is literally the introduction to the book. Right before this, there's a foreword from Ashley Rensburg, which is a great foreword. He wrote The Gray Lady Winked, which is the book about the New York Times. And so Ashley and I have become friends, and he wrote the foreword to the book. But this is the introduction. And there's a quotation at the beginning that you may recognize. "We will know our disinformation campaign has been successful when everything the American people believe is false." And that's by William Casey, director of the CIA from 1981 to 1987. Virginia Roberts folded 8 white towels into stacks, ensuring the seams lined up and the spa's floral logo appeared in the corner. She placed the stacked towels on a polished granite countertop. There were no customers, so she tied her blonde hair into a ponytail and resumed reading where she had left off, in an illustrated guide to massage therapy. She found the book fascinating. "I'm only 15, she reminded herself, but she had a goal now: to ascend from mere attendant at the luxurious Mar-a-Lago resort to real professional massage therapist." A woman with pointy black locks of hair appeared. Virginia offered the woman tea, as she always did, and asked politely whether she had an appointment. The woman didn't have an appointment, but she accepted the tea. With a friendly smile and with a proper English accent, the woman asked Virginia several questions about the spa before she asked about her copious notes in the massage book. With a bashful smile, Virginia shared her goal. The woman told Virginia that her boss was a wealthy man, and as it turned out, he was looking for a massage therapist for his frequent jet trips around the world. He would pay for her training if Virginia showed the right enthusiasm for the job. The woman handed Virginia her card and introduced herself. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. It was June 2000, and a 3-year nightmare was about to unfold for Virginia as she followed in the path of dozens, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of young girls who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Later that warm summer night, Virginia visited Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, as many of the unfortunate girls did, before they accompanied him to Paris, New York, London, and Little St. James, Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. The girls were offered as sexual property, escorts, and quote-unquote massage therapists to some of the world's most powerful and wealthy men. Millionaires and billionaires, former presidents and foreign royalty, senators and judges, hedge fund tycoons and Hollywood producers, powerful attorneys and famous actors, chairmen of boards, CEOs of giant conglomerates. They all flew on Epstein's plush private plane. The plane was nicknamed the Lolita Express. Ascending from a resort attendant to a professional massage therapist was not in the cards for Virginia. Shortly after that night, as she tells the story, she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew of England, famed attorney Alan Dershowitz, and many others. Those known to have flown on Epstein's jet many times include Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, and countless others. No legal action was brought against Epstein for years. The first case brought against him occurred in 2005, when a different girl's mother brought charges of sexual assault on behalf of her daughter. Many other victims came forward immediately thereafter, revealing Epstein had been running a pedophilia rape ring since at least 1993. Local law enforcement amassed a litany of evidence and multiple witnesses. It looked like a slam dunk case. Epstein faced life in prison for sex trafficking. What ensued was one of the saddest chapters in American legal and media history. The FBI stepped in and took over the case from local Florida law enforcement. The federal attorneys heard hours of damaging testimony from the victims themselves and their families, but chose to use a grand jury, which protected Epstein from the most threatening charges. Epstein's powerful attorneys, including Alan Dershowitz, who himself was a frequent traveler on the Lolita Express, secured a highly unusual non-prosecution from U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. It was a sweetheart deal that required him to plead guilty to just one charge at the state level. In exchange, Acosta granted Epstein immunity and canceled an FBI probe into his activities. How was this possible? Acosta claimed orders had, quote unquote, come from above, that were, quote unquote, above his pay grade. National media coverage was nowhere to be found. A New York Magazine piece entitled "Billionaires Are Free" was one of few national pieces on Epstein at the time, but it vindicated him with a shockingly permissive "boys will be boys" attitude. And that was that. The national media uncharacteristically dropped a story about sex and famous people. Indeed, the media ran away from the matter of a major sex trafficking ring as if from an infectious virus. Epstein had to register as a sex offender following the quote-unquote non-prosecution, but 8 years later, he was still somehow flying on his personal jet with quote-unquote very young girls to his private Caribbean island on a weekly basis. It was as if he had never been convicted at all. The media stayed silent. Years later, after Virginia finally escaped Epstein's clutches, she married an Australian and took her new husband's name, Geoffrey. The birth of her daughter prompted her to overcome her shame and speak out. Virginia contacted national news organizations and penned a 139-page expose about her experience, which was eventually submitted as evidence against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. In 2016, she spoke directly with ABC News host Amy Robach. Robach was intrigued and she took up the story. She arranged a flight to New York for Virginia, and Virginia felt confident enough to tell Robach the whole horrifying story in person and on the record. Robach recorded it all and spent hours preparing a report on the bombshell revelations. The story would finally expose Epstein for what he had done. ABC News never ran the story. No corporate media channel picked it up, despite Virginia's dogged efforts. If the main priority of American news organizations is to generate clicks and views, as many Americans believe, this story was surely a godsend, but they all ignored it. Why? We will answer this question in this book. We are storytelling creatures, and that's part of this, is that, you know, as I mentioned before, I call this time the century of propaganda, and we're in this like propaganda era. And part of the reasons propaganda is so powerful is because we are storytelling creatures, because we were telling each other stories before we could read or write, and because we tend to relate to people through stories. We tend to relate to our lives through stories. And so I use stories in the book as well, because it's important to understand the power of stories, right? The power of that story. And to realize that every time you hear a story about like Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump or, you know, Joe Biden or Tony Fauci or whatever it is, or the COVID lab leak, you know, it's a story. And to understand that that's how you're going to relate to that as you go about living your life. And so I think it's just an absolutely crucial thing to realize. If we all agreed on everything, you wouldn't really need a government. You know,
Right.
everybody, if there weren't wealthy, powerful people trying to become more wealthy and powerful and willing to lie, cheat, and steal to do it, right? You wouldn't need government. So democracy, that's the founders knew that. I mean, in that era, in like the 1700s, right, coming out of the Enlightenment, coming out of the printing press and all this stuff, the free press, at that time was absolutely partisan, and you had nobody had pretensions to neutrality. The idea of like, oh, we're going to have neutral journalists who like write a neutral story. That was actually, and I write about this in a chapter on the history of our press, because I think it's important. It's like chapter 11. It's later in the book because I want people to get into the here and now. The book's really about the here and now. But I do think it's important to understand history. And so in this chapter, I really delve into the origin of the printing press, the Enlightenment, and the Reformation that happened as the printing press toppled the Catholic Church because of the spreading of information. But then going into the founding of this country, and the state of the press at that time was intensely partisan. And there was a newspaper for not just the Democrats or the Republicans, there was a paper for labor, and there's a paper for the Irish, and there's a paper for the Chinese. Every little group had its own paper. Everybody knew it was just advocating for its side. Many cities would have a lot of newspapers. I'm a little bit conflating a couple eras here. This is like late 1700s up through kind of the Civil War era, but just to make it simple. But then what happens is, because this is the beginning of newspaper consolidation, because there starts to be this profit, you can start to make a lot of money from newspapers, and people are realizing the ability of, we're not yet in the age of propaganda, which starts in the 19-teens and 20s, but people are starting to realize the ability to persuade people in like your local city. So these millionaires and like our current billionaires, like the sort of tycoons at that time, start buying up the newspapers. But then there's this real pushback saying this is going to hamper democracy. This is not the idea of democracy and the free press. This isn't why we have a free press protection. And so what happens is, and also this is the muckraking era, right? So we're moving into the era of the original progressive era, and you have like Ida Tarbell, who writes this amazing history of Standard Oil. And she basically lays out all of the corrupt practices, all of the monopolistic practices. And this is the early Rockefellers. This is when they're really making their money. That maybe John Rockefeller, the first one, basically becomes the wealthiest person on earth. And he's not real fond of Ida Tarbell and her work. And so he's trying to push back. And so he comes up with this idea that some people would say Bill Gates is doing now, or Bezos, of just buying up all the newspapers and getting them to take his side. But because in doing that, he raises all of these alarms that this is anti-democratic practice, they come up with this idea of neutral journalism. That he says, what we're going to do is we're going to have journalism schools. So they found a bunch of journalism schools. They all get started right around 1910, 1915. Missouri, Northwestern, Indiana, all the big journalism schools. And you're going to have to go to journalism school to be a journalist. And in journalism school, you're going to learn how to be a neutral observer. And then we're going to have these newspapers, and it's okay if I own them all, because they're all going to be neutral. They're all going to have these professional journalists doing neutral reporting. And so the whole idea, and so we're exiting that era. We're exiting the era of what I call professional, quote unquote professional, balanced, nonpartisan journalism. And there were some good times, in that era. There was some great journalism that came about in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You talked about the Fairness Doctrine comes into play, and the Fairness Doctrine was definitely on balance a good thing. It had a couple of issues. There were a lot of things that were left out. Certainly, like we didn't know the Gulf of Tonkin was fake until maybe 15 years ago, that never happened, and the whole Vietnam War was started on false premise. But there were some good things about it. But what I tell people when people say, this is so scary, like we're losing our neutral journalism, what's going to happen? And what I tell people is like, this is the natural state. This is how it always is. This is how democracy functions. So you have to have, the real enemy is censorship. That's the real problem. The problem, especially if the government's doing it. That's why you have a First Amendment. We have a First Amendment to prevent the government from censoring dissident voices. That's it. That's why we have it. So yeah, this ruling in Missouri versus Biden is fabulous. And I in my book, I tend to be very non-committal. Like I don't say one side is, the Democrats and Republicans are good or bad. I reserve my partisanship, if there's partisanship, is against censorship. That's really what I see as the greatest evil, is the censorship, the propaganda. And so this finding is great. And what it's going to do, hopefully, I'm sure it'll be appealed, and I'm sure they'll try to fight it. And there are people out there that really are taking the Biden side and like, what's going to happen if we can't censor the bad guys? If we can't shut them up, they're going to be able to speak
Washington
freely.
Post, New York Times is
Yeah,
definitely.
I mean, it's like
right.
if we let the bad guys speak, then then what? I mean, this movement back, and this is why I call it, we're moving into this new enlightenment. The internet, the invention of the internet, is the most potent invention since the printing press. And what the printing press did was not small. I mean, the printing press came along, the movable type printing press in Europe, and I compared a little bit to some earlier printing presses, but for all intents and purposes, that is when Johann Gutenberg invents that thing in Strasbourg, Germany, in around 1444, somewhere right around there. Within 50 years, the number of books in Europe went from like 50,000 to 12 million. And then you had just the flowering of all the stuff, of science, of art, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Suddenly we had this idea that you could have a government based on a piece of paper, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a constitution. People can write and read. And so I really talk about Thomas Paine. I think of him as the father of independent media, where a lot of the little presses at that time, right before the revolution, were just sort of like, here's the price of this commodity down at the docks, and here's what George III is saying from England about, the price of tea or whatever. But he did something very different. He was the first sort of, not the first, but for the sake of the analysis of American media history, he used his printing press to write this like absolutely phenomenal treatise called Common Sense, as we all know, which is still the highest selling book ever printed in America on a proportional basis, if you look at the number of people alive at the time. And that writing, that was free, that would have been censored by, the Bidens, right? Like, why would you want people to be able to write something like this? And that led to the American Revolution. And that led to I mean, it's a big part of it, led to why we're sitting here and have this thing called the Constitution, have free speech and free press and freedom of religion and assembly and the freedom to petition the government. People often overlook that one, but the freedom to petition the government, that's like, lockdowns and COVID. You have a freedom in the Constitution that predates this government, that is bigger than, that is a greater right than this government to tell the government that they're wrong and that you want it changed. Like, that is fundamental right that we have in this country. And a lot of countries, you don't have that right. So it's important to protect these rights.
When people found out I wasn't vaccinated, housemates, friends, they were like, well, aren't you exercising your privilege to get vaccinated? Because there are so many people in this world right now who don't have access to the vaccine, and you're basically like not honoring the privilege you have to get vaccinated. And it's interesting where we put these words like privilege and misinformation, because it's like, there is the privilege of being in a country where we can question the government and we can make choices for our own selves to say, do we want this in our bodies or not?
So that's what the printing press did in the 1440s. And that's how it led to, our Constitution, our rights, and led to sort of the whole, the first Enlightenment, really, which, led to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these other, I would say, giant moments of progress for humanity. Like, we could get into all of it, but they're like, to have these rights and to have the what the United States has been able to deliver. It's so funny for me to say this, because in my 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, I was like, as like a really hardcore Green Party guy, I was like aware of the the benefits in the United States, but I spent much more of my time thinking about all of the evils, and I still think about those things as well. But I feel like I now have a more balanced perspective on what the United States has brought about. And seeing the positives, and having traveled and seeing what other countries don't have and what we do have, I do value it a little bit differently. But anyway, so to draw the comparison and why I'm calling this the new Enlightenment is exactly what you're getting at. The internet is doing the same thing, but even broader. So what the internet is doing is it's allowing us to directly share our experiences with each other, right? So with the invention of the printing press, it went from like only like the monks in the monasteries and like a few sort of like noblemen like knew how to read and write. And there was no reason for the Catholic Church would say, why do you need that? You don't need to read and write. Like, we'll tell you what God says. And if you need an indulgence, you just pay us some money. and if you disagree, like, and then we'll call you a witch, or we'll call you a blasphemer, and you'll be burned at the stake, or you'll be, thrown on the rack. Like, no worries, like, it's all good. We got this under control, right? That's what the Washington Post would say. Like, no worries, like, it's fine. We're in power. Like, we don't want to make it easier for these weird blasphemers and witches to get their voice out. Then you might not think that the Earth is the center of the galaxy. So right, so the internet is doing the same thing, and it's terrifying to the people that have the top-down distribution of information today, which is the giant corporations that, I talked about the beginning and the Rockefellers and the sort of the beginning of this consolidation, which started in like the early 1900s, go a whole 100 years forward, and the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and then right into like 2004-5 with we're now down to 5 corporations basically own all of it. We're in a great apocalypse in the sense of that word, where an unveiling. The apocalypse is like the removing of the veil. We're in this phase of learning about things, which is what happened then too, where people learned, actually the sun is in the center of the galaxy, and actually, there's a lot more going on here, and there might still be God, but God's probably not exactly how the Catholic Church, all of these things that we learned at that time as a civilization. We're going through a similar phase, and it's even bigger. Now it's the whole world. Now it isn't just like you have to read and write. Like, I can literally get on, or you and I can have this conversation right now. And nobody told us we could. The who would be the bishops now would be like, the head of MSNBC or NPR. They didn't tell us we could have this conversation. The Washington Post would probably prefer we didn't. But like, we can have this conversation, upload it through this like miracle of like, it just suddenly is up there in the cloud, or whatever you want to call it, the sea, and the effect that it can have is profound, is unknown. And so we're seeing that. So yeah, like what you're saying, where things that used to be hidden that could be hidden for decades or centuries is no longer going to be hidden. I mean, COVID's a perfect example. I was writing this book, and what we know now about 2008, it took us a while. The speed with which we've learned about like the origin of the coronavirus, yeah, it certainly came out of the lab. I mean, it's, let's say 99% now. The evidence just continues to go in that direction.
Right.
And we were completely lied about that. And that was a wild, crazy conspiracy theory that got everybody kicked off of social media for about 16 months there. Or that, that the vaccine stopped the transmission of this virus. We now know that's certainly not the case. But that was also a wild, crazy conspiracy theory for a while. And there's a number of them, right? There's a number of these things, but it happened much, much faster, and that will continue to happen. And so that's what's really terrifying. So you look at something like Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's run for president right now. And I compare, if you look at Howard Dean, and then you look at Barack Obama, or maybe Dennis Kucinich, and then you look at Bernie Sanders, and now you look at Bobby Kennedy, right? These are people that are not, I'm just looking on the Democratic side now, the Democrat side. These are people that ran that were not supposed to win, right? That were not supposed to get there, right? So like Howard Dean, he was, remember the Dean scream? I don't know if this is like, if I'm dating myself, but this is 2004. And, Howard Dean is like running against the Iraq War, super popular, much more popular than John Kerry in terms of like in the base of the Democratic Party. But he has this event where like he's just won several contests, and he's giving this really enthusiastic, speech, or we're going to go to Arizona, we're going to go to Montana, we're going to like win all these states. And then CNN does this like super underhanded thing where they strip out all of the crowd noise and they play this video. And so it looks like he's just screaming to no one. It makes him look insane. And his face is all red because he just won all these contests, and there's all these people in the room, and it's this crazy, but they strip away all of the back. So it's just him. And they called it the Dean Scream. And they ran like this narrative for like a week. Do you want this man, with his finger on the button? This guy's too crazy. And his campaign was over. It was done. Like there's not another chance. And now Howard Dean obviously went on to do the things he did, and where he went with his career. But at the time, there was no internet really per se to create those narratives. Then I would jump forward to Obama, and Obama's kind of a special case, but I mean, if you look at the level to which they used the internet to run that race, it was unbelievable. And he actually, obviously won the nomination, became president. We could get into that. But then you look at Bernie Sanders, and that's where I spent a lot of my time, and I spent a full, almost 2 chapters of my book, looking at how the Sanders and Trump races in 2015 and 2016 were able to use the internet to create a parallel media structure. So
Mm.
it was a complete change from 2004. And now we're 8 years later than that, to where, yeah, you're saying like the polls now are finding, what is like 25% of people, fully identify, fully trust the corporate media, something like that is the latest. And the numbers aren't that much better for government institutions, for like Congress and even the Supreme Court. And you have, at the same time, the rise of this our ability to directly interact with each other and
Yes.
directly share our experiences. And yeah, you've mentioned a couple of times, like independent media can have its own biases. Independent media can have its own problems, and we need to understand that. But at the same time, there are different kinds of bias. And so I really define this in the book, and I hope people understand that there's different kinds of bias. And I use 3 words for them. There's what I call innocent bias, systemic bias, and nefarious bias. So innocent bias is the bias that we all have based on our political views, race, class, gender, upbringing, where we work, all those kinds of things, just who we are. If I report on a story, it's gonna be different than you, it's gonna be different than the next person, because we have our innocent bias. It's just who we are. And that affects news reporting. And it's important. It's not that it's not a problem, it is a problem. You wanna balance your media diet against innocent bias, everybody having the same outlook that you read. But it's innocent in a sense, it's not deliberate deception. Then we have systemic bias, which is the bias that comes from wherever you work. If you're a journalist, like who pays your check? That kind of bias is going to be, if you work at like MSNBC, you're not going to be able to write about the pharmaceutical corporations in a critical way because they get so much of their advertising from them. If you work at, what was it? When Comcast owned NBC and they were, interested in the war in Iraq starting because they're going to make a lot of money, you're not going to be able to criticize the Iraq war on that network because, again, that's systemic bias. It's the bias of where you work. So we have innocent bias, systemic bias. And the third is nefarious bias. And this is deliberate manipulation of the narrative by intelligence agencies or by people that, Operation Mockingbird. I spent a lot of time talking about Operation Mockingbird in the book, one whole chapter on, that's out, that's declassified. The CIA recruited journalists, placed journalists. Nefarious bias, directly manipulating, placing narratives, removing other narratives. And there's evidence that that's still going on, way more so now, that even in like, the editorial board at the New York Times or Newsweek, there'll be a couple of CIA people actually working at the editorial board. So if they have to make decisions about what's going to be covered or how, they'll be aware of that. And so that's nefarious bias. So when you understand these 3 kinds of bias, I think it's very helpful in trying to understand, rather than just say, oh, all the news is biased, it's all just like, I can't trust any of it. We'll get into there and say, okay, what kind of bias? It's a different kind of bias. And so this is why I really recommend my media diet I recommend is heavily weighted towards independent media and away from the corporate media, because all of it has innocent bias. You're definitely going to find the innocent bias everywhere. People have their political viewpoint, they have their, personal characteristics that make them look at things a certain way. But the independent media generally does not have systemic bias or nefarious bias. And that's very important. So you just have to control for this one kind of bias. Whereas if you go and you flip on NPR or CNN or Fox, you have to figure, okay, what's the innocent bias of this person talking? What's the systemic bias, the fact that they work there? And what's the nefarious bias of like, why do they just have this guy giving his opinion? And you read, and they didn't mention it, but you go on, on the internet and you find out he worked at the CIA for 25 years and probably still does. So it's like, you have to think of all of those kinds of things going on, and they're all important. And in the independent media, you still have to think about this, but it's a different world. And there's one other thing too. Independent media, just by going to independent media, it shifts our brain a little bit more towards media consciousness. In one key way. I'm not going to go to Want to Know, or you don't go to Red, White, and Blind thinking, this is the truth. You go saying, this is a truth. This is one person's perspective, or this is one group of people's perspective. So your brain is already in this like a little bit more skeptical, critical way of like, okay, I'm fully interested. I'm going to read it. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to let it affect my viewpoint. But I'm not coming in as like, this is the capital T truth of the world. Whereas you go to corporate media and that's how they present it. They present it, if you flip on CNN and they're talking about, the climate right now, or they're talking about, this ruling in Biden versus Missouri, they're going to present as this is the truth.
Yes.
And so they're actually trying to shut off that critical part of your mind. They're actually deliberately trying to shut it off. So these are the reasons that I really recommend people heavily weight. Like, think of independent media as like the good, like, meats and vegetables and fruits that should be on your plate. And the corporate media is like, I don't know, like the cheese or it's
Like
something that's like, it's not
the canned
poisonous,
peaches, the
but it's like,
GMO
yeah,
canned
like
peaches.
minimize, yeah, kind of that kind of thing.
Like, oh yeah, you need your vitamin C. Here's like canned GMO peaches swimming in microplastics.
Yeah, with glyphosate sprinkled on top. Yeah, pretty much.
World, like I love the idea of a balanced media diet. Could you share more just about that? Like, how can someone create a balanced media diet for themselves?
Yeah, sure. So again, I have balancedmediadiet.com. I hope you'll either, get the book and I lay it out there, or go to balancedmediadiet.com, or obviously feel free to do both. Definitely intended to teach us to recognize the different kinds of bias, to seek out things that are censored. I think that's a really important thing. If you see something is censored, go check it out. If it was censored for a good reason, you'll know that right away, typically. But a lot of times the stuff that's censored, it's censored and it's called disinformation and misinformation because it threatens a power structure that is really not serving our greater interests. And it's better if that censored thing were just free to be heard. But yeah, so the balanced media diet, the other thing with the balanced media diet is I recommend for people, if you try it, which you should, and I do it, and you find it overwhelming, one way you can narrow it is pick an issue or two, right?
Mm,
So rather than just go to, like, I can look at this again, like what the sources are, rather than just go to, so Monday is NPR is on there, and Glenn Greenwald on the basic diet, 30 minutes. So rather than just go to NPR and just flip it on, or go to Glenn Greenwald and flip it on, which you can, which I think is fine. They both will produce really interesting stuff with their own biases. And I have a lot to say about NPR. I have a whole section on NPR and its issues, but there's some great reporting on NPR. And obviously I think Glenn Greenwald's, very worthwhile. But you could pick an issue instead. You could say, you know what, these next 2 weeks, I just want to focus on like Ukraine and interest rates. Just picking
mm,
two random issues out there. So then instead of just flipping on NPR or going to npr.org and reading it, you'd go to NPR and you'd read about Ukraine and interest rates. And you go to Glenn Greenwald and you'd search, so that you actually focus on an issue. I mentioned that as one option to sort of narrow it down if it feels overwhelming to just go and read these brand new news sources maybe you haven't read. Then on Tuesday, it's Breaking Points and Tucker Carlson. And so, if you don't want to just like, maybe you don't want to just flip on Tucker Carlson, who's now on Twitter, or Breaking Points, although I think they're both worthwhile, although I don't agree with everything either site says, which is part of the fun of it.
right.
I do recommend you think of it as fun a little bit. Like, it's
Yeah.
growth. It's like, it's broadening your mind. It's taking on a new puzzle, rather than it being this like overwhelming thing. Or a lot of people I talk to are actually scared. And they're scared of, it's different things, but I think one of the fears that people have is that if I relinquish my certainty that this one source is right, if I relinquish my clarity that these are the good guys and those are the bad guys, then I'm lost. I'm a ship without an anchor. And I might have to believe everything the crazy people say. Right? I might have to suddenly, I might have to start thinking that Bill Clinton, what was it you're saying? He's like a blood-sucking pedophile or something. Like, I might have to start thinking that. And I don't want to think that. So I better just stay here where I'm a ship at anchor and I know that, like, I've raised my flag and I'm an NPR flag raiser. And now so what I want to do is to encourage people to say, you know what, you don't have to change any of your views. You can still think about Bill Clinton the same way, Donald Trump the same way, Putin the same way if you want. I'm saying you probably won't after a number of, after a couple months or a year of this, but you can, and just broaden your perspective and start to take in different perspectives, because you're smart enough and you're a human being endowed with fabulous talents, and you have a brain that can do critical thinking.
Thanks so much for joining us on this call. Any last thoughts about the future of the media or the future of society as a whole?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Amber, and I'd be happy to be back again. We could continue this conversation. It's been great. I really appreciate your questions and yeah, and everything you've brought out of me in terms of explaining the book and why I wrote this book and what I hope to do.
Mm.
I guess I would say just my only parting thought is there was a period in writing this book, and I mention it in like chapter 7 or 8, where I'm really looking at the Disinformation Governance Board and that time when like Jen Psaki and Joe Biden were basically saying we need to be able to pull people off of social media if they start spreading disinformation, like one by one, they want to be able to do that. And I stopped writing the book for a day, and I just was like, why am I spending my time on this? I'm not being paid for this. This is my passion. If my book is just going to get censored and thrown in the scrap heap of history. And what I realized, and I came back to the project invigorated the next day, is that if that's going on, right, and I don't mean to just put Biden and Psaki as the source of blame, there's plenty of blame to go around. If that's happening, what more meaningful thing could I do with my life than to raise the alarm bell about this and to chart a path forward where we can go in a positive direction with our eyes open as to the dangers that are inherent in where we are now. And so, yeah, I would just say to all your readers, I wrote the book to be as accessible to everyone as possible, and I would love to continue the conversation.
That's really beautiful. Yes, as David Martin said, who's a great thinker of our times, he says, this conversation never happened before. So may this lead to a bunch of planted seeds and other people who see this video.
Amen. May it be so.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. Great to have you with Want to Know, and best of wishes with what's next for you.
Thanks so much to you as well, Amber. Really appreciate it.
All right. Talk soon.
Okay, talk to you soon.